Sophie Toscan du Plantier was a 39-year-old French television producer who seemed to live a charmed life. She was married to Daniel Toscan du Plantier, one of France's most powerful film producers, a man who rubbed shoulders with actors, directors, and politicians. Together, they were a couple often seen at film festivals and Parisian parties, surrounded by glamour. But Sophie wasn't really drawn to that world. She was known as reserved, thoughtful, and deeply private. Friends said she sometimes felt suffocated by the high society circles her husband thrived in. Instead, Sophie craved quiet, solitude, and nature. She had a love for poetry and writing, and she was happiest when she could escape the constant noise of Paris. Years earlier, she had found her refuge, a small holiday cottage in Schull, County Cork, Ireland, perched on the rugged coast. Unlike Paris, Schull was remote, windswept, and wild, where the Atlantic Ocean crashed against cliffs, where mist rolled in over the fields, and where, in winter, nights were long and eerily silent. To the locals, Sophie stood out. She was elegant, Parisian, and a little mysterious, but they remembered her fondly. She wasn't aloof. She was polite and warm, though she often kept to herself. She came to Ireland not for company, but for solitude. Here, she could walk the countryside, read, or write without interruption. By December 1996, Sophie had been making these trips for years, and just a few days before Christmas, she made a last-minute decision. She would fly to Cork alone. Her friends in Paris thought it was odd. After all, Christmas was a time to be with family. But Sophie said she wanted a short break, a few days of peace before the holiday. Some said she wanted to work on writing projects. Others whispered she may have been escaping tensions in her marriage. Whatever her reasons, she didn't tell many people. On December 20th, she landed in Ireland and drove the winding, rural roads to her cottage. It was cold, damp, and dark, the kind of Irish winter night where the landscape feels almost otherworldly. Sophie settled in, planning to stay only a few days. She visited a local shop, spoke briefly with neighbors, and made phone calls back to France, all routine. But what no one could have predicted was that this quiet, last-minute trip would mark the end of her life. Within 72 hours, Sophie Toscan du Plantier, an elegant Parisian woman who sought refuge in the Irish countryside, will be found brutally murdered outside her little holiday home. And her death would become one of Europe's most infamous unsolved mysteries. On the cold morning of December 23rd, 1996, Christmas was just days away in the sleepy seaside town of Schull. Most locals were preparing for the holidays, running errands, finishing shopping, or simply hurrying to escape the biting Irish winter chill. One of those locals was Shirley Foster, a neighbor of Sophie's. Around 10 a.m., Shirley got in her car and began driving down the narrow, winding lane near Sophie's cottage. It was a road she had traveled countless times before, bordered by hedges, fields, and scattered farmhouses. But as she rounded a bend that morning, something caught her eye. In the grass by the gate of Sophie's property, Shirley noticed a strange shape. At first glance, it looked like a discarded bundle. Maybe cloth, maybe a tarp, something pale lying against the frost-covered ground. But something about it made her slow the car. And when she got closer, she realized with horror it was not an object. It was a body. Shirley stopped, heart racing, and stepped out of her car. The bitter cold cut through the air as she moved closer. And there, sprawled on the frozen earth just outside the little holiday cottage, lay Sophie Toscan du Plantier. She was dressed in her night clothes, a long-sleeved top and leggings, suggesting she had either just stepped outside her home or had been pulled there suddenly. Her hair was matted, her clothing torn. The scene was unlike anything Shirley had ever witnessed in her quiet community. Sophie's injuries were immediately apparent, and they were brutal. She had been beaten savagely, her face so badly disfigured she was nearly unrecognizable. Later investigators would note that the weapon was likely a concrete block and a heavy stick or rock, both found at the scene, covered in blood. Her arms and hands bore deep cuts and fractures. Defensive wounds proved she had fought desperately for her life. Bones were broken. Her body showed signs of a sustained and frenzied attack. The sheer violence of it was shocking. This was not a robbery gone wrong. It was not a quick killing. Whoever had attacked Sophie had done so with rage, with a personal fury that seemed out of place in such a quiet village. Shirley, terrified, rushed back to her car and called for help. Within minutes, local Gardaí, the Irish police, arrived, followed by paramedics. But there was nothing they could do. Sophie had been dead for hours, likely since the early hours of the morning. Word spread quickly through the village. Shull was a tight-knit place where violent crime was virtually unheard of. For residents to hear that a woman, an outsider, but one they knew, had been found beaten to death outside her own holiday home just days before Christmas was almost too much to process. That morning, Shull's peaceful reputation shattered, and the case that would become one of Ireland's most notorious unsolved murders officially began. The investigation began immediately. Irish police, the Gardaí, sealed off the cottage and surrounding fields. Forensic teams scoured the frosty ground for clues, photographing every footprint, every broken twig, every bloodstain. It was clear from the start that Sophie's final moments had been violent, chaotic, and terrifying. The pathologist's report gave investigators their first real timeline. Sophie had likely died between midnight and 2 a.m. The cold night air had slowed rigor mortis, but her body temperature suggested she had been outside for hours before Shirley Foster found her. What struck investigators most was this detail. She had been barefoot. That meant Sophie had probably left the warmth of her cottage suddenly, without time to dress properly, maybe hearing a noise or a knock at her door. She had stepped out into the icy darkness and never came back. But why? What could have lured her outside at that hour in the first place? At first, Gardaí tried to piece together Sophie's life in Ireland. They discovered she had been staying at her holiday cottage alone, as she often did. She knew only a handful of locals. She had no close ties to the area, no business rivalries, no history of disputes. In fact, she had been due to fly back to Paris the very next day to spend Christmas with her husband and teenage son. On paper, she had no enemies in Ireland. That forced detectives to turn their attention to the only logical pool of suspects, the locals. The question became, who in Shull knew Sophie was there that December? Who had seen her in the hours before her death? Gardaí began conducting door-to-door interviews, asking residents about noises in the night, about strangers passing through. Some recalled hearing dogs barking. Others remembered faint screams carried by the wind. But in a rural place like this, late night sounds often went unnoticed. Still, the violence of the attack suggested something deeply personal. This wasn't a mugging or a burglary gone wrong. Sophie had been targeted, and then the story exploded. When word reached Paris, the headlines caught fire. Sophie wasn't just any victim. She was the glamorous wife of Daniel Toscan du Plantier, one of France's most influential film producers. Their social circle included actors, directors, politicians, the upper crust of European cinema. Within days, French journalists descended on the windswept Irish coast. Television crews arrived. The little town of Shull, normally a quiet fishing and tourist community, was suddenly overrun with reporters, their vans clogging the narrow lanes. For the first time, this isolated Irish village became the focus of international attention. Cameras captured the bleak cottage on the hillside, the lonely lane where her body was found, and the locals shuffling nervously past reporters' microphones. But behind the headlines, Gardaí faced a grim reality. The case was already complicated. Forensics in 1996 were limited. DNA testing was in its infancy. The rural crime scene had been exposed to the elements for hours before Sophie was discovered, and evidence was fragile at best. Still, one thing was certain. Whoever had murdered Sophie lived close enough, or knew enough, to find her at her remote cottage in the dead of night. And soon, investigators' eyes began to fall on one man in particular. A man who wasn't just a local, but also a journalist. Attention turned almost immediately to a man who lived just a few miles away, Ian Bailey. Bailey was hard to miss in Shaw, a tall, brooding British journalist with a booming voice and wild hair. He had moved to Ireland years earlier to escape the chaos of London. Locals described him as eccentric, intelligent, and unpredictable. Someone who could be charming one moment and aggressive the next. He was known to have a volatile temper, especially when drinking. What put Bailey under the microscope wasn't just his reputation. It was his behavior in the days after Sophie's murder. Bailey worked as a freelance reporter for several newspapers, and as the story exploded in France and Ireland, he was right there, covering it. But what unsettled investigators was how much he seemed to know. Bailey was often one step ahead of official police briefings, dropping details in his articles that hadn't been made public. How did he know so much? Was it his journalistic instincts, or something darker? Then came the scratches. When Gardaí visited Bailey shortly after the murder, they noticed he had cuts and scratches on his arms and hands. To police, they looked suspiciously like defensive wounds, injuries someone might get in a violent struggle. Bailey waved it off, claiming he had hurt himself chopping wood and tending to farm animals. But doubts lingered, and then the whispers started. Multiple witnesses later told police that Bailey, while drinking, had confessed to killing Sophie. Some said he boasted about it. Others claimed he slipped up and made strange comments about the case that only the killer would know. Each time, Bailey denied it, insisting people were twisting his words or outright lying. In 1997, Gardaí made their move. Bailey was arrested. The community held its breath. But after hours of questioning, prosecutors ruled the evidence was too weak. No fingerprints, no DNA, no eyewitnesses placing him at Sophie's cottage. It was all circumstantial. Bailey walked free. 2 years later, police tried again. Bailey was arrested a second time, dragged back into custody, grilled about his movements the night Sophie was murdered. Once again, the case crumbled. Still no forensic link. Still no smoking gun. And once again, he was released. To many in Ireland, Bailey was guilty in everything but law. To others, he was the victim of a witch hunt, a man unfairly targeted because he was an outsider with a difficult personality. Bailey leaned into that narrative. He insisted he had nothing to do with Sophie's death and launched lawsuits against several newspapers for defamation, claiming his reputation had been destroyed. The case grew more complicated with every passing year. The lack of physical evidence kept Irish courts from prosecuting, but in France, Sophie's family refused to let the case die. They believed Bailey was responsible. French investigators launched their own inquiry, building a case in parallel with Ireland's. The result was something unprecedented. 2 countries, 2 legal systems, and 1 unsolved murder. And while Sophie's family fought for answers, Ian Bailey's shadow loomed larger than ever over the quiet town of Shaw. For more than a decade, Sophie's case remained stuck in limbo. In Ireland, prosecutors insisted the evidence wasn't strong enough to go to trial. But in France, where Sophie's family lived, the story was very different. French law allows prosecutors to pursue cases even if the crime happened abroad, as long as the victim was French. And Sophie's family refused to give up. They believed Ian Bailey was guilty. They wanted justice, even if Ireland couldn't deliver it. So, French authorities launched their own investigation. They combed through the Irish case files, interviewed witnesses, and built a dossier of evidence. In 2019, more than 20 years after Sophie's death, Bailey was put on trial in Paris. But here's the twist. He wasn't there. Bailey, still living in West Cork, refused to attend. Ireland had refused multiple French extradition requests, arguing that the case was too weak and that sending him over would be a violation of his rights. So the French court proceeded without him. It was surreal. Witnesses testified. Evidence was presented. Prosecutors painted a picture of Bailey as a violent, unstable man who had killed Sophie in a fit of rage. Bailey's lawyers in Ireland called the trial a sham, pointing out again that there was no DNA, no fingerprints, no direct proof. But in May 2019, the verdict came down. Ian Bailey was found guilty of Sophie Toscan Duplantier's murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. It was a moment of relief for Sophie's family, but also frustration. The conviction was symbolic. Bailey was never extradited, never imprisoned. In Ireland, he remained a free man. For the people of Shull, the case never stopped haunting them. Some believed Bailey had done it. Others thought he was a scapegoat, and still others whispered about darker possibilities. Maybe Sophie's killer was someone else entirely. Someone who slipped away while the world fixated on the eccentric journalist. Bailey, for his part, never stopped protesting his innocence. He gave countless interviews, wrote about the case, and portrayed himself as a victim of police obsession. But the cloud of suspicion never lifted. In 2021, Ian Bailey died suddenly at the age of 64, reportedly from a heart attack. With him, many believe the truth died too. To this day, Sophie Toscan Duplantier's murder remains one of the most infamous unsolved cases in Ireland's history. Was Ian Bailey truly guilty, as the French court believed? Or was he a convenient suspect in a case too brutal and baffling to ever fully solve? The only certainty is this. On a freezing December night in 1996, a brilliant, vibrant woman was beaten to death outside her holiday cottage, and nearly 3 decades later, nobody can say with absolute certainty who killed her. In August 1996, in the small Belgian town of Bertrix, 14-year-old Letitia Delhez was walking home after spending the evening at the local swimming pool. It was just after 9:30 p.m., the end of a warm summer day. Letitia was known in her community as quiet, responsible, and dependable. She wasn't rebellious. She wasn't the kind of teenager who stayed out late or made her parents worry. That night, though, something felt off. When Letitia didn't come home on time, her parents became concerned almost immediately. They knew their daughter's habits. She always walked the same short route back from the pool, and she was never late. An hour passed, then another. By midnight, panic had set in. The Delhez family went to police to report her missing. The first clue came quickly. Several witnesses who had also been at the swimming pool recalled seeing a suspicious white van parked near the entrance around the time Letitia left. Some remembered the van lingering. Others noticed 2 men inside, watching. One detail stuck out. The van had tinted or covered windows, making it impossible to see clearly inside. For police, this immediately raised red flags. Across Belgium, whispers have been growing about children and teenagers disappearing under eerily similar circumstances. Just months earlier, 2 8-year-old girls, Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo, had vanished. Before that, 2 teenagers, and Marshall and Yves Lambrex, had disappeared after a night out. Now, a 14-year-old girl, walking home from the pool, was gone without a trace. Something was happening in Belgium, and Letitia's case would soon expose it. Her parents described her in detail to investigators. Her height, the clothes she had been wearing, her route home. Police began combing through the streets around the pool. Neighbors were questioned. Officers knocked on doors, asking if anyone had seen the van or heard a disturbance. But the small town had gone quiet that night. In August 1996, in the small Belgian town of Bertrix, 14-year-old Letitia Delhez was walking home after spending the evening at the local swimming pool. It was just after 9:30 p.m., the end of a warm summer day. Letitia was known in her community as quiet, responsible, and dependable. She wasn't rebellious. She wasn't the kind of teenager who stayed out late or made her parents worry. That night, though, something felt off. When Letitia didn't come home on time, her parents became concerned almost immediately. They knew their daughter's habits. She always walked the same short route back from the pool, and she was never late. An hour passed, then another. By midnight, panic had set in. The Delhaz family went to police to report her missing. The first clue came quickly. Several witnesses who had also been at the swimming pool recalled seeing a suspicious white van parked near the entrance around the time Letitia left. Some remembered the van lingering. Others noticed two men inside, watching. One detail stuck out. The van had tinted or covered windows, making it impossible to see clearly inside. For police, this immediately raised red flags. Across Belgium, whispers have been growing about children and teenagers disappearing under eerily similar circumstances. Just months earlier, two 8-year-old girls, Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo, had vanished. Before that, two teenagers, and Marshall and Yves Lambrex, had disappeared after a night out. Now, a 14-year-old girl, walking home from the pool, was gone without a trace. Something was happening in Belgium, and Letitia's case would soon expose it. Her parents described her in detail to investigators. Her height, the clothes she had been wearing, her route home. Police began combing through the streets around the pool. Neighbors were questioned. Officers knocked on doors, asking if anyone had seen the van or heard a disturbance. But the small town had gone quiet that night. The one solid lead remained a white van. Witnesses managed to give police enough fragments of a license plate number to create a partial ID. That detail would become the thread that unraveled everything. Within hours, investigators began cross-checking vans registered in the region, and one name surfaced, a name already tied to suspicion. The van belonged to Mark Dutrix, a man with a criminal past. At the time, Dutrix lived about 90 kilometers away in Charleroi, a decaying industrial city. He was already known to law enforcement as dangerous. In the 1980s, Dutrix had been convicted for the abduction and assault of young girls. He served time in prison, but was released early on parole. Local police had long suspected he hadn't changed his ways. Now, his van was being tied to the disappearance of another teenager. As investigators dug into Dutrix's background, the picture grew darker. He wasn't just a petty criminal. He was meticulous, manipulative, and extremely dangerous. Rumors circulated that he was part of a larger underground network exploiting children. For years, parents had whispered about connections between Dutrix and powerful figures in Belgium. But up until now, nothing concrete had ever stuck. The urgency in Letitia's case was different. She had disappeared just days earlier. Police knew if she was alive. The clock was ticking. Every hour mattered. By August 13th, 5 days after Letitia vanished, investigators moved in. Acting on the witness tip, they raided one of Dutrix's properties in Marcinelle, a suburb of Charleroi. The house looked ordinary from the outside, but inside it was anything but. Officers discovered hidden doors, secret rooms, and a cellar beneath the floor. When they broke it open, they found two girls. One was Letitia, the other was Sabine Dardenne, a 12-year-old who had disappeared earlier that summer. Both were alive, but barely. They were pale, malnourished, and terrified, locked away in a small, soundproof cell. It was a moment of shock. Letitia's disappearance had not just been solved. It had blown open one of the worst child abuse cases in European history. The rescue of Letitia was the turning point. Without her abduction, police might never have raided Dutrix's home when they did. They might never have found Sabine, and they might never have uncovered the horrific truth about the girls who hadn't survived. Letitia's case didn't just reveal a single crime. It exposed a monster, and with him, the possibility of a network of accomplices who had protected him for years. Her disappearance in that one August evening in Bertrix became the crack that split open the Dutrix scandal and changed Belgium forever. When Belgian police raided Mark Dutrix's house in August 1996, they expected to find evidence. Maybe Letitia's clothing, maybe the van. What they didn't expect was to find Letitia herself alive. The moment officers pried open the hidden cellar is one that investigators never forgot. The air was foul, stale, and damp. The space was barely big enough for 2 small beds, a toilet bucket, and a lamp. And huddled inside were 2 terrified girls. One was Letitia Delhez, the 14-year-old who had vanished just 5 days earlier. The other was Sabine Dardenne, a 12-year-old who had been missing for nearly 3 months. Both were trembling, malnourished, and pale. They had been kept in almost complete darkness, only allowed food when Dutrix appeared. The door was steel, disguised under a false wall. No one walking through the house would ever have known they were there. The rescue stunned the nation. Against all odds, 2 missing girls had been found alive. But alongside the relief came horror. If these girls had been held here, what about the others? Investigators quickly turned their full attention to Mark Dutrix. On paper, he was a handyman, an electrician, a man who owned several shabby properties across Belgium. In reality, he was a career criminal with a terrifying past. In the 1980s, Dutrix had already been convicted of kidnapping and assaulting 5 young girls. He had served time in prison, but was released early. Despite psychiatric reports warning he was highly dangerous and likely to reoffend. He was supposed to be monitored after his release. He wasn't. Authorities failed to follow up. That failure would prove catastrophic. By the mid-1990s, Dutrix had quietly begun building something horrifying. He modified his houses with hidden rooms and underground cells. He kidnapped girls, keeping them locked away. He wasn't acting alone. He had enablers. When police arrested Dutrix, they also detained several others connected to him. Among them were his wife, Michelle Martin, and an associate, Michel Lelivre. Michelle Martin was accused of helping Dutrix lure girls and, most disturbingly, of failing to feed 2 captives when Dutrix was briefly imprisoned. Her neglect led directly to the deaths of Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo, the 2 8-year-olds who had gone missing the year before. Lelivre, meanwhile, admitted to helping Dutrix with kidnappings, including transporting victims in the infamous white van. And then there were whispers of more powerful people. Dutrix himself claimed he was part of a wider pedophile network, that he wasn't just acting for himself, but supplying children to influential figures in Belgium and possibly beyond. Whether that was true or a manipulative tactic remains debated to this day. But in the 1990s, the idea of a protected network shook Belgium to its core. The rescue of Letitia and Sabine gave police leverage. They pressed Dutrix for information on the other missing girls. Slowly, the full extent of his crimes emerged. In addition to Julie and Melissa, police uncovered the remains of Marshall, 17, and Yves Lambrex, 19, 2 teenage girls who had vanished after a night out at the seaside town of Ostend in 1995. Both had been held captive, abused, and eventually murdered. By the time the investigation was complete, Dutrix was tied to the deaths of at least 5 young girls, with Letitia and Sabine as the only known survivors. Letitia's abduction had been the breaking point. Without her disappearance, police may not have moved so quickly. Sabine might have remained trapped. The full scale of Dutrix's crimes might never have been uncovered. Her case not only exposed Dutrix, but also revealed shocking failures within Belgian law enforcement. Early release of a known predator, ignored warnings, and years of inaction. For Belgium, it was more than a criminal case. It was a national trauma. The Dutrix affair, as it became known, led to massive protests, with hundreds of thousands of Belgians marching in what was called the White March, demanding reforms, accountability, and justice. The moment investigators forced open the hidden cellar under Mark Dutrix's house was one they would never forget. The air was thick and suffocating, smelling of damp concrete and human neglect. Officers had to step carefully, navigating a narrow stairwell that led to a small, pitch-dark room. The door itself was steel, hidden behind a false wall, and locked with multiple bolts. It was clear that whoever had designed it wanted no one to find its occupants. Inside, the two girls huddled together, shaking uncontrollably. Letitia Delhez, 14, was pale and frail, her clothes dirty and torn. Her eyes were wide with fear, scanning the faces of the officers who had suddenly appeared in her secret world. Beside her was Sabine Dardenne, a 12-year-old who had been missing for months, surviving in the same tiny, windowless cell. Both had been starved, exposed to cold and damp for weeks, sometimes months. Their hands bore bruises and scratches from trying to protect themselves from the harsh treatment they endured. The rescue was miraculous, but it immediately raised horrifying questions. How many other girls had been through this same terror? Investigators quickly realized this was not an isolated case. Dutrix had been operating for years, systematically abducting children, holding them captive, and in several cases, killing them. Officers began to comb the house, discovering more than just the cellar. Hidden behind false walls and concealed floors were remnants of a carefully planned system of captivity. Small beds barely large enough for one child, makeshift toilets, and containers for food and water. Every aspect of the space was designed for long-term confinement. This was not impulsive. This was methodical. Dutrix had created a prison inside his own home. Neighbors described Dutrix as a quiet man, almost invisible in the community, which made the discovery even more shocking. On the surface, he seemed ordinary, a handyman, a property owner, someone who moved about town unnoticed. But inside, he harbored monstrous intentions, meticulously planning and executing abductions without drawing attention. The white van, the one witnesses had noticed near Letitia's disappearance, became a critical piece of the puzzle. Police learned Dutrix had used it to transport his victims, sometimes across provinces, keeping them isolated from anyone who might intervene. His movements were calculated. He chose remote locations, planned routes, and selected times when witnesses were unlikely to be around. The physical and psychological trauma suffered by Letitia and Sabine was immense. Sabine later recounted being forced to stay in the dark for hours, sometimes days, with minimal food or water. Letitia had endured similar treatment, being told that if she made a sound or tried to escape, Dutrix would punish her or worse. Both girls had witnessed acts of violence and control designed to break their spirits. Once the girls were removed from the cellar, medical teams rushed in. They documented the malnourishment, dehydration, and injuries. Psychological evaluations began immediately. Both girls were in shock, struggling to process the trauma. The authorities recognized that their rescue was just the beginning of a long recovery process. The raid also confirmed suspicions about Dutrix's other victims. Two girls, Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo, 8 years old, had vanished a year before. Despite exhaustive searches, they had never been found alive. The discovery of Letitia and Sabine provided indirect evidence of their likely fate. Dutrix's pattern of kidnapping, holding captive, and ultimately killing victims had been consistent for years. The nation watched in horror. Belgium had long whispered about missing children and strange disappearances, but now the truth could not be ignored. Parents were terrified, demanding answers, while the government faced scrutiny for failing to monitor a previously convicted child abductor. For investigators, rescuing Letitia and Sabine was bittersweet. It was a success story, but it also confirmed the grim reality. Dutrix had been operating with impunity for years, exploiting legal loopholes, early prison release, and systemic oversights. Every detail of his operations, the hidden rooms, the van, the careful scheduling revealed a man who was patient, meticulous, and dangerously organized. The rescue galvanized the investigation. Authorities could now trace Dutrix's activities with concrete evidence: van routes, property ownership, and the hidden cells in multiple locations. They realized they were uncovering just the tip of a larger criminal network, one that may have implicated more people than initially thought. Letitia's survival was a rare glimmer of hope amidst the horror. It provided crucial testimony about Dutrix's methods, his routines, and his accomplices. Her recollections, combined with forensic evidence from the cellar, allowed police to piece together the timeline of abductions and highlight the failures that had allowed Dutrix to continue his crimes. By the end of the week, the Belgian authorities had begun compiling charges: abduction, false imprisonment, sexual assault, and murder. The rescue of Letitia and Sabine was the turning point without it. Dutrix might have remained free, his victims forever lost, and the full scale of his crimes undiscovered. The tiny girls' faces became symbols of both innocence and resilience. Letitia's bravery, her ability to endure the horrors of captivity, ultimately helped save her own life and brought one of Europe's most notorious criminals to justice. As the investigation widened, the shocking reality of Mark Dutrix's crimes came into focus. Police discovered that Letitia and Sabine were not anomalies, they were the exceptions. At least 4 other young girls have been kidnapped and killed, their lives brutally stolen by Dutrix. Among them were Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo, both just 8 years old when they disappeared in 1995. Their tiny bodies have been found buried in Dutrix's garden, hidden under layers of soil and debris. The sight of their graves struck the nation with horror. The girls had been taken under the guise of normalcy, lured away from school and playgrounds, only to meet a fate that was incomprehensible. Investigators also discovered the remains of the Marshall and Yves Lambrechts, 2 teenagers who had vanished after outings in coastal towns. Both had been held captive before their deaths, buried in makeshift graves in isolated locations. Each discovery painted a clearer picture of Dutrix's methodical cruelty. He wasn't killing in the heat of the moment. He was executing a plan, one that had been in motion for years. It became evident that Dutrix had accomplices. His wife, Michelle Martin, was implicated for helping him lure girls and for neglecting the 2 surviving captives while Dutrix was briefly imprisoned. Other associates, including Michel Lelivre, had aided in transporting victims, sometimes using Dutrix's infamous white van. Without their cooperation, Dutrix's operations might not have been so extensive or efficient. Even more disturbing were the whispers and rumors of a wider network. Powerful men in Belgium and possibly abroad who may have turned a blind eye, protected him, or even participated in his crimes. While full proof of such connections remained elusive, the mere suggestion sent chills through the public. It meant that Dutrix's crimes might have been only the visible part of a much larger, darker world. For Letitia Delhez and Sabine Dardenne, survival was nothing short of miraculous. The trauma they endured was unimaginable. Dark, cramped cellars, starvation, abuse, and the constant fear that death was imminent. Their testimonies, given bravely to police and later in court, revealed the true scale of Dutrix's depravity and the chilling precision with which he carried out his crimes. Their survival also became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Without their accounts, much of the horror might have remained hidden. Through their words, investigators could reconstruct the abductions, the conditions of captivity, and the final moments of victims who had not survived. Each recollection added a layer of clarity to a story that was otherwise almost impossible to believe. Belgium, already shocked, erupted in public outrage. People were horrified that such crimes could happen in their country, under the noses of the authorities. The failure to properly monitor Dutrix after his earlier convictions became a national scandal, leading to widespread protests and demands for systemic reform. Tens of thousands marched in the White March, carrying white flowers in memory of the girls who had died, and in support of those who had survived. In the end, the Dutrix case wasn't just about the crimes of one man. It exposed the dark intersections of neglect, corruption, and complicity. Letitia and Sabine's survival gave investigators the key to unraveling it, and their courage became a symbol of hope amid incomprehensible tragedy. As investigators dug deeper, the horrifying scale of Dutrix's crimes became undeniable. The two girls rescued from his hidden cellar were the lucky ones. Many others had not survived. At least 4 other young girls have been kidnapped and murdered, their lives extinguished in secret, hidden from the world. Among them were Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo, both just 8 years old, whose tiny bodies were discovered buried in Dutrix's own garden, right under his nose. The thought that children had been trapped, abused, and killed so close to where he lived was almost too much for the authorities and public to process. The list didn't end there. And Marshall and Yves Lambrex, teenagers who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, were found in makeshift graves elsewhere, isolated, hidden, deliberately concealed. Each discovery confirmed the chilling reality. Dutrix's crimes were not random acts of violence, but the product of meticulous planning and calculated cruelty. Even more shocking was the network Dutrix had built around him. He did not act alone. His wife, Michelle Martin, was deeply involved, helping lure girls, assisting with logistics, and keeping the surviving victims captive during Dutrix's temporary imprisonments. Other associates, including men who helped transport or hide victims, played key roles in sustaining his operations. Investigators began to suspect that Dutrix's reach might extend even further. Whispers of a wider network. Powerful, influential men who may have turned a blind eye or actively protected him spread throughout Belgium. It suggested that Dutrix might have been shielded by people with wealth and status, making the horrors even more insidious. For Letitia Delhez and Sabine Dardenne, survival was nothing short of miraculous. They had endured weeks, possibly months, in darkness, malnourished, terrified, and completely at the mercy of a man who saw them as disposable. Their ability to escape alive gave investigators the first clear insight into Dutrix's methods, revealing the details of abductions, captivity, and the psychological and physical abuse that many others did not survive. Their testimonies were not just accounts of survival. They were critical pieces of evidence. Through them, authorities were able to reconstruct the chilling timelines, map out Dutrix's movements, and identify his accomplices. Each memory Letitia and Sabine shared revealed just how close they had come to death and how methodical Dutrix's cruelty had been. The case gripped the nation. The public learned that a predator had been operating in plain sight for years, exploiting loopholes in the justice system, taking advantage of failures in surveillance, and possibly benefiting from the silence of those who could have intervened. Belgium had been shaken to its core, not only by the loss of life, but by the realization that children's lives had been stolen under circumstances that could have been prevented. Amidst the horror, the girls' survival became a symbol of hope and resilience. Letitia and Sabine, though scarred for life, were living proof that even in the darkest moments, escape and survival were possible. Their courage and cooperation with authorities allowed Belgium to finally bring Dutrix to justice, and their voices ensured that the stories of the victims who didn't survive would not be forgotten. The arrest and trial of Marc Dutrix sent shockwaves through Belgium and France. People were horrified, not just by the crimes, but by the failures that had allowed him to operate for years. Dutrix had been arrested before. He should never have been free. Evidence later showed that authorities had missed multiple opportunities to stop him. Public outrage erupted. In October 1996, more than 300,000 people marched in Brussels during the White March, demanding justice and reforms to prevent such horrors from happening again. At trial, Letitia Delhaize testified bravely, recounting the terror she had endured. Along with Sabine Darden's testimony, her story became the most compelling evidence of Dutrix's cruelty. In 2004, Dutrix was convicted of multiple murders, kidnappings, and rapes and sentenced to life in prison. For Letitia, survival was a hard-won victory. For the families of the girls who didn't make it, the pain remained unbearable. The Dutrix case remains one of Europe's darkest scandals. A chilling mix of murder, systemic failure, and whispers of corruption. And at its center was a single miracle, the rescue of Letitia Delhaize, whose survival finally exposed the monster hiding in plain sight.